All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome into the first ever live video edition of PrepCast. I'm your host, Garrett Jones, talking the latest, as usual, in Houston area high school sports. And it's been a different week, but at the same time, something pretty similar to what we saw about a month and a half ago when the first hurricane, Hurricane Laura, came through the Gulf Coast area and postponed several high school football games. We've obviously seen a lot of that this week. We've seen COVID cancellations starting to mount. That's not a surprise. I think that everybody kind of knew that that was going to happen at some point this season. But we've also seen it kind of taking place in college sports, in the NFL, high school sports, especially in the Houston area, unfortunately have not been immune. So we'll get into that a little later. We'll also talk about the biggest week 6 games, take a look at the 6A and 5A polls, and as usual, end up with area headlines. But since this is the first live edition of the podcast, you're watching on YouTube. You can find it on Twitter as well, at Houston PrepCast and at Garrett Jones on YouTube. Feel free to stop me and ask questions at any time. I'll do my best to monitor the chat. If you're looking for area prediction, any kind of insight on what to expect here in week 6, I'm your man, and I would love to take you up on that. So feel free to ask questions. Nothing's off limit as long as it relates to high school sports here in the Houston PrepCast. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. The biggest games of week 6. And these kind of digging a little deep, thanks to the Houston Chronicle, who put together this article highlighting several area matchups. And a friend of the podcast, Adam Coleman, pointed a couple of these games out. But there's one that I vehemently agree with him for pointing out, and that's Baytown Lee versus Friendswood. Lee is actually eyeing a 3-0 start. Crazy but true. Last week, all 3 Baytown area teams, those being Goose Creek Memorial, Baytown Lee, and Baytown Sterling, which I'm fortunate enough to cover for Vibe Sports. Every single one of those teams won. And according to Alan Dale of the Baytown Sun, that it could be the first time in history that that's ever happened. So on the same night that big. So that is a remarkable but true fact. And Lee has been really the centerpiece of that. They could start 3-0 for the first time in 10 years. They're looking for their first playoff appearance in 10 years. Friendswood, on the other hand, has had a really, really tough schedule coming into the season. They're still looking for win number 1. They took a tough loss to Summerbrook and Clear Creek. So they're certainly going to be hungry against an undefeated squad. Elsewhere, New Caney versus Reed, Friday at 7. There are 55 years in difference between these two varsity programs. Porter first fielded a varsity team in 2010, and New Caney way back in the 1960s. Porter's looking for its 5th consecutive playoff appearance. So certainly some motivation going on there. I like the way these two teams match up. I don't know much about the X's and O's and these specific matchups as what we're going to see on the field tonight, but it does kick off tonight at 7, and two programs looking to establish their footing in the 2020 season that's had certainly its fair amount of ebbs and flows. Elsewhere, Spring versus Decaney. This series has been really close since these two teams met for the first time in 2008. Spring's actually leading the series in the 12 matchups, 7-5. The interesting thing about this game, though, playing at Ford Stadium, opened last year, one of the biggest, newest high school football facilities in the state of Texas. $39 million facility opened last year. This is the first matchup between those two schools in the Spring area. So certainly interesting to keep an eye on there. I'm going to go ahead and pick Baytown Lee in the first game. I do think that they're going to get off to a 3-0 start. Friendswood's going to be hungry. They're going to get a lot of pushback. I'm actually going to go with Porter. I think that they've got a really good shot in that New Caney versus Reed game. And Spring versus Decaney, I do think that, that one's going to be close. I'm just going to go ahead and go with Decaney since that series has been so tight. I think that they draw within one series when they're playing at Ford Stadium. So certainly worth keeping an eye on those games. Elsewhere, let's take a look at the area polls as we do. Not a lot of movement. Nothing surprising at the very top. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. North Shore now 2-0. They defeated Klein Collins a week ago. They're at the top of the Vipe area poll. Katy, despite losing its starting quarterback, we talked about that last week, they have settled into it. They defeated Cywood 66-21. They are now 2-0. Westfield got its first win of the season last week. They defeated, Fort Bend Hightower by 10 a week ago. Katy Taylor also threatening the Katy High School Tigers at 2-0 now, Close win for them against George Ranch last weekend. Really good defensive game, 26-14 the score there. Bridgeland now 2-0 after they knocked off Shadow Creek. And I'll get into Shadow Creek a little more in a little while, but suddenly the defending state champions are now 0-2 on the season after a tough loss to North Shore. Now a really good Bridgeland team. They jump up 3 spots in the bike poll to number 5 this week. Rounding out the top 15, Cy-Fair checks in at 2-0 at number 6. Atascocita took a shocking loss to Allen 52-27. I thought they were going to be a little more competitive in that game. No shame in losing to Allen, obviously a really strong powerhouse in the North Texas area. But Atascocita is a team that I think there's a really good chance that they could actually win out. They are one of the most popular picks for a kind of under the radar look at a possible 6A champion come December. So keep an eye on them after that first loss of the season. Speaking of that, Klein Collins took its first loss to North Shore by a touchdown. So they kept it really close. Again, no shame losing to the number 1 team in 6A right now, but they dropped to number 8. Tabo Memorial now 2-0 after defeating Westbrook, hanging 66 points in an absolute shootout, 129 combined points between them and Westbrook a week ago. Dickinson, another one of those really strong under-the-radar team. They're now 1-0. They defeated Ridgepoint handsomely a week ago. Katie Tompkins, now 2-0. How about those Katie schools? Katie Taylor, Katie, and Katie Tompkins, a combined 6-0 with very decisive victories for every single one of them. We mentioned Shadow Creek. They are plummeting down the poll. They're down at number 13, 0-2 after that tough loss to Bridgeland. I think that the jury's still out on their season right now. Apologies for that. Lost our camera feed there. It certainly happens. Technical difficulties from the home studio this afternoon, but I'm still excited to be bringing PrepCast to you live, no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what kind of limitations technology puts on it. But as I was saying there, Shadow Creek still struggling out of the gate. I think that the jury's still out on their season. I think that they could very easily find themselves still competing for a state title at the end of it all. Cypress Ranch, now 1-1. They picked up their first win of the season last week, checking in number 14. And then Klein Kane checks in at number 15. We'll have a little bit more on Klein ISD schools. COVID situation's not looking great there right now, but they are still checking in at number 15. How about 5A? Lots of interesting storylines here. Manville, what a way to start their season. 53-20. They take care of Crosby. They are atop at number 1. Foster is 1-0. They didn't play last week, but another one of those under the radar possible 5A champions. Again, another Katy school. I don't think a Katy school has lost yet this season. Katy Patel now 2-0. They defeated Morton Branch by 3 last week. Fort Bend Marshall, another one of those sleeper teams, 1-0 after winning a defensive matchup against Fort Bend Elkins, 7-0 last week. How about that? You don't see that a lot in high school football, especially not in Texas, but 2 defensive-minded teams clashing there. Magnolia in at number 5. They're 1-1. Fort Bend Hightower took a surprising first loss of the season to Westfield by 10 a week ago. They're at number 6. LaPorte, another one of those teams that's really flying under the radar. They have really impressed, jumping into Bikes rankings for the first time this season. They are now 2-0 after a decisive 27-3 win over Clear Lake. Angleton with a big win over Episcopal. Not a lot of people saw that coming. Episcopal's got high expectations this year, but they are now in the poll at number 8. Lake Creek in at 1-1, and then another team rounding out the top 10 after Lake Creek is in at number 9. Baytown Lee, they check in at number 10. They defeated Santa Fe decisively, 41-14 last week. So that wraps up the polls. That wraps up the games to watch this week. How about the area headlines and some volleyball making some news? I'm always excited to feature volleyball on this podcast. How about Clara Brower of the Woodlands, one of the most predominant players in this area? She actually became the school's all-time leading setter by setting their assist record in a win this week. So good for the Woodlands. Clara Brower, a player that's definitely going to get some looks at the next level. Beaumont United and Sterling actually postponed their game. It's supposed to be tonight at 7 in Beaumont, obviously affected by Hurricane Delta. That's not going to be the first time that you're going to hear me mention that in the area headlines. I was actually supposed to be on the call for that game on Friday evening, but it has been moved to Saturday afternoon. In case you're interested in going to that game, the gates open at 1 in Beaumont. More cancellations. Dickinson, we mentioned, all the way in at number 10 in 6A on their area polls. They're actually canceling their games with Clear Falls and Clear Lake over the next 2 Fridays due to some positive COVID tests. So what a strange situation for them. We're in week 6 of the high school football season, and after that many 42 days, Dickinson's going to end up having played just 1 game. And you never know the way that COVID kind of breaks down. Quarantines can be different. Recovery times can be different for different players and athletes and such. So you don't know what the situation is going to be there. They could end up playing that game next week against Clear Lake if everything gets sorted out, but certainly up in the air, which is really a shame for a really strong football team. Shadow Creek, 0-2 on the season. They have actually suspended their October 9th and October 15th contests. One of the 15th was supposed to be the district opener against Pearland Dawson due to COVID precautions. So, not many positive tests from what I found, but they're certainly wanting to play with an abundance of caution. What a strange season for them. I mean, you could throw a blanket over every single team and say that it's been strange overall, but certainly not what Shadow Creek was expecting through the month of October. Also, girls basketball. We're getting very close to basketball season, believe it or not. I believe late November, early December is the target date for the UIL. We haven't gotten anything concrete there, but Kendall Hunter of Cy-Fair commits to play for the University of Texas, along with teammate Rory Harmon, a dynamic basketball force there for Cy-Fair. And that's especially interesting because they're actually going to go play for former Mississippi State head coach Vic Schaefer. They're at UT. It kind of flew under the radar because that was way back in March when Schaefer decided to take his national championship winning talents to Austin. But yeah, a couple years ago, Mississippi State was right in the thick of things along with UConn in 2017 and 2018 as potential national champions. They obviously lost to Notre Dame in 2018. They topped UConn in the Final Four and then lost the championship game. But Vic Schaefer, obviously a very talented head coach for the Longhorns, and he's going to have 2 Houston area products in his backcourts to build around. So certainly exciting news there for Roy Carmen and Kendall Hunter. Hunter announcing her commitment this week. Elsewhere, I mentioned Klein Kane playing really well right now in the area poll, but unfortunately, Klein ISD has 31 active COVID cases. That's the most among Houston area schools. Their games, including volleyball, have been canceled until further notice. So their situation is certainly up in the air. You feel for those athletes. Hempstead and Hallettsville, a 3A game postponed, I should say. These 2 teams are trying to make that game up. I do believe that is due to Hurricane Delta and not current COVID cases. It's always strange, living in this area when you have any kind of postponement or cancellation. You have to consider, okay, is this weather related or is this COVID related? That's just 2020 for you. But I do believe that one is weather related due to Hurricane Delta hitting the East Texas and Southeast areas. Certainly goes without saying, if you're in that area, you have my thoughts and prayers for sure. You certainly feel for Louisiana as well. Cameron County getting hit with a hurricane for the 2nd time in 6 weeks. Just so hard to believe. And no doubt that's impacted the high school sports world. But, obviously much more to be concerned about there. Like I said, we're about to wrap up, so feel free if you have a question, don't hesitate to ask in the comments section. Scores from West Texas, I should say. I always want to end the podcast on a light note. How about this? 162. That's the number of games in an MLB regular season schedule, not in 2020, obviously. It was also the number of points scored in the Eastland versus Panhandle game out in West Texas. 91-71, the score between those 2 teams. So in case you think that your team gives up a few too many yards or points this week, know that it could always be worse out in West Texas. What a game that was. Certainly offense is starting to settle in the high school football season, but none more than Eastland, who hung 91 points. That's the most I've seen in the state of Texas through 6 weeks of the 2020 high school football season. So thanks for joining along. We'll be back next week. I'm expecting to talk with Baytown Sterling head coach Robert Toomer for that podcast. So stick around for our interview with him in that episode. But for now, thanks so much for tuning in. As always, enjoy your games this week. Tell me where you're going. Find us on Twitter at Houston PrepCast. You can find me there as well at G Jones on Air. You can subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'll be doing some more live episodes like this in the future. Enjoy doing this afternoon. I'm going to be tonight in West Columbia for Columbia versus West. It always mixes me up there. It's West Columbia, the city, but Columbia High School. So Columbia High School taking on Needville in 4A. So I'm going to be there tonight helping produce that game for Vibe. You can find it at vibe.com/Houston/Texas/Houston. Continue to look for podcasts here on the iHeartRadio app. We come out every single Friday afternoon trying to cover and canvass the latest in area high school football. Not a lot going on this week besides cancellations, but I think that will change over the next week as Hurricane Delta moves out of the area, and hopefully we see COVID recoveries. But until then, signing off for the last time today, I'm your host, Garrett Jones. Feel free to find us on YouTube and Twitter, and we'll see you next week.